Okay, welcome back to Behind the Curtain. As always, I'm your fearless host, Bowen Esserson. Thank you for watching. If you like the content, hit that like button, hit the subscribe button, and share it with your friends. It helps me to grow the channel and create more content for you, my loyal viewers. All right, so what are we going to do? Today, we are going to jump into California, newly instituted California statute, went into effect on January 1st, statute AB 2098, and it relates to how COVID misinformation and how doctors communicate with their patients, not parents, what they communicate to their patients and how they treat their patients. So, two judges in California recently came to diametrically opposed opinions on this. They're completely different on how they interpreted it. And I think that difference, that stark difference, highlights the California state legislature's carelessness and incompetence in drafting a statute that is vague, and as far as doctors might be concerned, this would be pretty puzzling. And it may chill speech. What can I say? How can I treat my patients in order to be in compliance with the state statutes and the decisions by the state medical board? So this is an article that I'm going to read through by Jacob Sullum of Reason Magazine. He published it on January 27th. As an aside, Reason Magazine is a publication that I would describe as slightly libertarian in their views, very heterodox in their views. They employ journalists from center-right to center-left, and I think they have two things in common. One, willingness to present the facts openly, honestly, and fairly. And secondly, to consider opinions and arguments from all sides of the political spectrum, both politically and culturally, and to entertain those debates and arguments equitably all the way through. So, AB 2098, the question: how does California define COVID-19 misinformation? Judges disagree, but doctors are expected to know. So let's jump into misinformation first. The California law defines misinformation as false information that is contradicted by contemporary scientific consensus, contrary to the standard of care. That may not make a lot of sense, but as we go through the article, we'll get more into it. How does the dictionary define misinformation? The dictionary defines it as unintentionally incorrect or misleading information. That means you state something that you believe to be true, but maybe it's not exactly true, it turns out, or it's at least somewhat misleading. It needs context around it, and maybe to be a little more nuanced. Disinformation, on the other hand, is deliberately false information, which is intended to mislead, and this typically relates to propaganda from different government organizations, state actors like us, Russia, Iran, running disinformation campaigns and other countries designed to create dissent, discord, and chaos, essentially. So disinformation is intentional, misinformation is unintentional information that sometimes just needs a little more context. So this week, a federal judge said California's definition of COVID-19 misinformation that can trigger disciplinary action against physicians is unconstitutionally vague. So one federal judge said the way California defines COVID-19 misinformation is unconstitutionally vague. In another case involving the exact same law, a different federal judge completely rejected that claim and said essentially that the language was clear and concise and easy to be interpreted. So Let's take a look at it. And by the way, when you have that stark disagreement between two federal judges in a state over the interpretation of a law, I think it highlights the incompetence, or at least the sloppiness, of the state legislature in writing a law that's clear and concise and easy to interpret equitably and fairly in all cases by all people. And also, if two judges are unable to come to agreement, how are doctors with no legalese, no judicial background or legal background, how are they supposed to parse out what they're saying to their patients or how they're treating their patients will not run afoul of the state law or the law or I guess their state medical board? How can they be certain that they won't face disciplinary action and or lose their license because of something they say to a patient or a treatment they prescribe to a patient? So under AB 2098, which took effect on January 1st, says it shall constitute unprofessional conduct for a physician and surgeon to disseminate misinformation or disinformation related to COVID-19, including false or misleading information about number one, the nature and risks of the virus, number two, its prevention and treatment, and number three, the development, safety, and effectiveness of COVID-19 vaccines. So let's step back 2 years. 2021, the vaccines came out. Everything that was said about the vaccines at the beginning of 2021, it's safe, it's effective, you won't get it, you can't spread it. Anything to the contrary was deemed misinformation. You were labeled as an anti-vaxxer. If you even suggested or wanted to ask questions about how it was safe and effective, how it would prevent you from getting it, how it would prevent you from spreading it. A year later, it's clear to everybody, and nobody even disagrees, that it doesn't prevent you from getting it, and it definitely doesn't prevent you from spreading it. So what the government would have labeled as misinformation is now correct information. I think anybody can draw their own conclusions as to the dangers it might pose to American citizens by allowing the government or even unelected bureaucrats to define misinformation. Who defines it? Is it the Biden administration? Is it the Trump administration? Is it unelected bureaucrats like Anthony Fauci? For a lot of people, if Trump's defining what misinformation is, that's scary. For a lot of other people, if Biden's deciding what misinformation is, that's equally scary. So I think it's very difficult and a very slippery slope to start allowing government actors to define misinformation, as we've already seen in the COVID-19 pandemic. So that language, including false or misleading information about the nature and risks of the virus, its prevention and treatment, and the development, safety, and effectiveness of COVID-19 vaccines, that language, according to the New York Times reporter Stephen Lee Myers, was narrowly tailored to address the waves of misinformation that have churned through the course of the pandemic. As we know, a lot of that misinformation is now accepted mainstream fact. So we need to be careful. Disregard for the moment that addressing misinformation by prohibiting it seems blatantly inconsistent with the First Amendment and the principles revolving around the First Amendment. Is that journalist, right to describe AB 2098 as narrowly tailored? Let's take a look. So William B. Shub, a judge on the U.S. District Court for the Eastern District of California, does not think so. By the way, full disclosure, that judge was appointed, I believe, in 1990 by George H.W. Bush. He could possibly have a right-leaning bias. I don't know. The other judge we're going to discuss was appointed by Joe Biden last year, maybe. So he could have a left-leaning bias. I don't know. I don't have either idea where ideologically either of these judges sits. So William B. Shub said in the case Hogue versus Newsom, he issued a preliminary injunction against enforcement of AB 2098 on Wednesday. He said the state's definition of misinformation violates the right to due process because it, one, fails to provide a person of ordinary intelligence fair notice of what is prohibited, and two, is so standardless that it authorizes or encourages seriously discriminatory enforcement. Again, some of you might have seen that during the pandemic. Fred W. Slaughter, a judge on the U.S. District Court for the Central District of California, reached a strikingly different conclusion in a completely different case, McDonald versus Lawson, on December 28th. So Slaughter rejected a motion for preliminary injunction. He stated that the law was clear enough to give physicians fair notice of what they can say to patients without jeopardizing their licenses. So as Shub saw it, California's definition of misinformation is grammatically incoherent and unintelligible. Note, the central problem, he said, is that the phrase contemporary scientific consensus, have you heard that before? Scientific consensus, trust the science? Some of you might have heard that. Has no clear meaning, especially in the context of COVID-19, a new disease that has generated conflicting and involving scientific opinions. It is unclear to me how shutting down a debate over issues revolving around science, it's unclear to me that shutting down that debate helps us get us to truth. Science is about debate. It's about people with different theories, postulating those theories, coming together to debate them, pose their best arguments, and somehow getting to the truth, or temporarily what's the truth anyway, and allowing people to make their decisions based on that science. So it's not clear to me that shutting down debate is a very effective way at arriving at truth or consensus. So the central problem, he said, I guess I just read that. So because the term scientific consensus is so ill-defined, he wrote, physician plaintiffs are unable to determine if their intended conduct contradicts the scientific consensus and accordingly what is prohibited by the law. What scientific consensus, right? Which scientists are included in scientific consensus? Is it scientists from Brazil? Is it scientists from Africa? Is it scientists from Japan, Sweden, the US? Is it the CDC, the NIH? Is it the World Health Organization? Is it doctors that are just practicing in local communities? Who comprises consensus? So let's see. Shub rejected the state's preferred interpretation of AB 2098. California's, and here's what he said, California's interpretation of AB 2098, which reads the law is requiring that misinformation include three elements. One, that it's false information. That is, two, contradicted by contemporary scientific consensus. And three, contrary to the standard of care. And according to Shub, there are several problems with that interpretation. First, the law says prohibited advice includes false or misleading information. Again, who decides what misleading is, or false, which means it's not limited to statements that are demonstrably wrong. Second, while it's not clear what contemporary scientific consensus means, in my opinion, it means whatever the government decides it means at the given moment. And again, that should scare most people. It's hard to imagine a situation in which the state medical board would conclude or would come to the conclusion that a physician's statements were contradictory to whatever scientific consensus they agree upon, but were nevertheless true. I don't see a situation where that could happen. Third, if misinformation is limited to advice that is contrary to a standard of care that the medical board already was applying, the law is unnecessary then because it adds nothing to pre-existing regulations. So fourth, the law's sloppy language makes it unclear how these supposedly distinct elements interact. So if legislators meant to prohibit medical advice that meets 3 separate criteria, Stubbs said they should have included that language in the bill, which they did not. A couple of things they didn't do, according to Shub. They didn't bother to insert the word "and" or even a comma between contradicted by contemporary scientific consensus and contrary to the standard of care. So it's generally vague. Is it "and"? Is it "also"? What is it? So under the first interpretation, the interpretation that might state that medical advice contrary to the standard of care whenever it contradicts a state-defined consensus, under that interpretation, AB 2098 would be redefining the standard of care. Under the second interpretation, the one favored by the state, the law would accomplish nothing as long as doctors adhered to the standard of care they were already supposed to follow. They would not have to worry that they could get into trouble for candidly expressing their opinions about the nature and risks of COVID-19, its prevention and treatment, or vaccines aimed at reducing its severity. So, sounds like there's a lot of problems with the way the law is written and the way it could or could not be interpreted. And despite all of these problems, Slaughter, the other judge, accepted the state's reading of AB 2098. Slaughter stated the following: the measure's definition of misinformation is comprised of 3 components, as we've already discussed: demonstrably false information, which could change next week; contradicted by contemporary scientific consensus. Whose consensus? Contrary to the standard of care. Which standard and by whom? So if you define the statute in light of California's established definition, this is what Slaughter said, if you define the statute in light of California's established definition of standard of care, which California defines as the skill, knowledge, and care exercised by practitioners under similar circumstances. I'll come back to that actually. Then it is apparent from the statute that the contrary to the standard of care requirement imposes a burden on the state to demonstrate that treatment or advice which would otherwise qualify as false and contradicted by contemporary scientific consensus must also be in violation of standard of care as defined by California. So in other words, if bureaucrats or whoever is tasked with investigating doctors for misinformation, if they do determine that it's false, however the doctor is applying the approved standard of care and treatment, then the doctor would be on safe ground. So it would be up to the state to prove that the doctor is not providing the accepted standard of care, accepted treatments, and of course that the information they're giving their patients is demonstrably false. For instance, demonstrably false would be, you have an upset stomach, chew on this cyanide capsule. That would be demonstrably false as a course of treatment for a stomach ache. I'm not a doctor, but I think that would be demonstrably false. Okay, so it seems to me that this assumption must be clearly stated in the law by inserting the conjunction "and" between contradicted by contemporary scientific consensus and contrary to the standard of care. It needs a conjunction, not a comma. So, moreover, as defendants concede, to the extent a scientific consensus is unclear, AB 2098 would not impose liability because there is nothing to contradict. Okay, so in other words, to be misinformation under AB 2098, the state must show that a scientific consensus exists and the information provided by a surgeon or physician both runs contrary to it and is demonstrably false, and that providing that information in the context of treatment or advice to a patient would be contrary to the skill, knowledge, and care exercised by a like colleague in similar circumstances. So they're saying the information provided must run contrary to the scientific consensus, and they have to prove that a scientific consensus actually exists. I don't know how they do that. Is demonstrably false, and that providing information in context of treatment or advice to a patient would be contrary to the skill, knowledge, and care exercised by like colleagues in similar circumstances. So accordingly, the court finds misinformation is not impermissibly vague in that it requires by its statutory conduct or statutory text a false statement of information that is contradicted by contemporary scientific consensus and also runs afoul of the applicable standard of care. So under this interpretation by Judge Slaughter, physicians who dissent from whatever the medical board deems to be the scientific consensus don't need to worry about disciplinary action unless they tell patients that it's something demonstrably false and also violate the standard of care. Which, as I said, I think if they want it to be and, they need to put and in the statute and not leave it vague. I'm not an attorney, but if two judges completely disagree on how to interpret it, inserting the word and would make it much easier to interpret that consistently. So, to be put another way, a doctor would be in the clear if he contradicted the scientific consensus, according to Slaughter, even if his statements were demonstrably false, as long as his services were consistent with the skill, knowledge, and care exercised by practitioners under similar circumstances. But since physicians were already subjected to that, I think it makes it superfluous. And why do so many doctors suggest that we get a second opinion? Do all doctors prescribe the same treatment, the same care to cancer patients, people who need brain surgery? I think people are often advised to seek a second opinion when it comes to treatment and care for whatever their ailment or illness might be. So despite the state's claim that AB 2098 ultimately changes nothing, regulators charged with enforcing the law can be expected to scrutinize the speech of doctors who dare to depart from the scientific consensus. And my contention would be, if the state is claiming that the statute changes nothing, why have the statute? Somebody's not being honest. And somebody's not being honest. The transgression might amount to expressing skepticism about ever-shifting advice from public health agencies such as the Centers for Disease Control and Prevention on contentious issues such as the merits of universal masking, the effectiveness of cloth masks, the effectiveness of vaccines in preventing the contraction or spread of COVID, the benefits of vaccination for young, healthy persons for whom COVID presents statistically negligible, almost zero adverse effects. It almost certainly they are not in danger of being hospitalized or dying from COVID-19. So why would we vaccinate young kids? This is preposterous. And if last year you had said, hey, we shouldn't vaccinate young children, you would have been ostracized, called an anti-vaxxer. On some social media sites, you might have been banned, had your channel removed, etc. So I think it's a slippery slope and one we all should be very concerned about. So under the state's interpretation of AB 2098, the medical board could decide that a doctor's advice contradicted the contemporary scientific consensus which the board might equate with the CDC's latest recommendations. And we know how the CDC's latest recommendations went throughout the pandemic. They shifted constantly, and the goalposts were constantly moving. What they deemed misinformation one day, the next day was fact. So the board might also conclude that the doctor's advice was false or misleading. It nevertheless could decide that the doctor's treatment practices met the pre-existing standards of care, which according to the state was not changed by AB 2098. Again, if nothing's changed, why implement the statute? Again, something's not right with that. Physicians who want to avoid that ordeal, and here's where the real problem lies. Physicians who want to avoid the ordeal of having to determine whether their speech or their treatment runs afoul of this law are going to practice, or most likely will practice, self-censorship. And that is a speech-chilling device that we've seen used again and again in numerous countries around the world, and something I would hope all citizens in America would like to avoid. So, because Shub concluded that AB 2098 is unconstitutionally vague, he did not directly address the claim that it violates the First Amendment, but he noted that vague statutes are particularly objectionable when they involve sensitive areas of First Amendment freedoms because they operate to inhibit the exercise of those freedoms. To show standing in this context, he said, a plaintiff would only need to demonstrate that a threat of potential enforcement will cause him or her to self-censor themselves in prescribing or giving information to a patient and prescribing treatment to that patient. Again, that's never good. 2 California chapters of the ACLU filed a brief in McDonald versus Lawson that raised similar concerns. They said it undoubtedly reaches speech protected by the First Amendment. It expressly limits the ability of physicians to speak about certain topics to their patients and thereby restricts their ability to communicate. Would you want to go to a doctor who says, I can't really give you my opinion on it, but here's what Dr. Fauci says. Can't give you my opinion, and here's how Dr. Fauci says I have to treat you. Might not really be what I would recommend, but we got to go with Dr. Fauci. That sounds nuts. If you want it to go that way, good for you, but I bet most of us have no desire to see things play out that way when we go to see our doctor. Okay, so in the 2002 case, Conant versus Walter, the U.S. Court of Appeals for the Ninth Circuit, which decidedly leans liberal and includes California, held that the federal government violated the First Amendment, when it threatened to revoke the prescribing privileges of doctors who recommended medical marijuana to their patients, advice that was contrary to the scientific consensus as federal officials defined it. You want the feds defining what scientific consensus is, or do you want scientists to get together and have an open, vigorous, and honest debate about what the science, about the interpretation of the science, in hopes of reaching a better conclusion, or at least the best conclusion we can reach given the information that we have? So, an integral component of the practice of medicine is the communication between a doctor and a patient, the appeals court said. Physicians must be able to speak frankly and openly to patients. That decision, the ACLU brief said, plainly forecloses the state from censoring physicians' discussion, medical advice, and recommendations related to COVID-19 unless the content-based regulation can meet strict scrutiny. So, back to Slaughter, who disagreed that the statute was vague. In Slaughter's view, AB 2098 is consistent with the First Amendment because it incidentally burdens speech as a regulation of professional conduct. He said the law only requires that while administering medical treatment or advice to a COVID-19 patient, the doctor needs to avoid providing demonstrably false information that is contradicted by the prevailing scientific consensus and in a manner that violates the current standards of care as described by the state medical board. That conclusion hinges on accepting the state's implausible reading of Statute 2098. But Shub thought that interpretation was hard to justify based on the text of the law, and even if it were accepted, he said, it would not clarify what scientific consensus means in this context. So, 2 federal judges considered this statute and came to diametrically opposed conclusions and interpretations about what it means. Yet physicians without a legal degree or judicial experience are expected to figure out what the law requires, knowing that they're risking their licenses and livelihoods if they guess wrong. In those circumstances, self-censorship is both prudent, you want to keep your job, you've got a family to feed, and consistent with what California legislatures apparently were trying to achieve. We've seen this more and more in the past 10 years. And again, we should fight back against it and be very wary when the state tries to impose speech restrictions upon professionals and citizens alike. Comment in the comment section below. Tell me what you think. If you liked it, again, smash that like button, hit the subscribe button, share it with your friends. Helps me to create more content. I'm not sure what I even said there. It helps me to create more content and grow the channel. Again, thank you very much for watching. I'll see you next time.